It is 1450 KMMS, 1340 KPRK. My name is Chris Griffin. Of course, that was the president from Friday's eulogy in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm joined in the studio by Judith Heilman, one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Montana, longtime Bozeman resident, also a former Palo Alto Police Department detective. And I thought in a brief conversation we had, not this most recent weekend, Judith, but previous weekend, when I wanted to find out, is race relations in this country, in the state of Montana, and even specifically here in Bozeman, is it an issue?
Yeah, race has been an issue in our country since the first colonialists came to the shores of what became America. So the Native Americans were the first victims of racism in this country and continue to be so. And race continued to be a problem when the first slave was brought to these shores from across the Middle Passage and offloaded and sold. So, race is a problem in this country and has been a problem in this country for centuries. It's manifested in many, many different ways, not only one-on-one, but also structural racism, systemic racism, aversive racism, which is much more subtle, microaggressions, which are also subtle. And I'd be happy to give you some examples about that, about those two last ones, those two subtle ones. And, so we're here to talk about that. One of the reasons that Racial Equity Montana exists is to provide information and education and tools to help people learn how to recognize these different forms of racism and how to combat them in whatever ways that they know, that they feel comfortable once they learn and practice how to recognize and how to confront them.
I had, when I started discussing the incidents in Charleston on the radio program last week and made listeners aware that I was going to embark upon this series of conversations, a rolling forum as I'm discussing it, as I phrased it, I was told by several listeners via email and via phone calls to the station, racism doesn't exist in Bozeman. As an African-American woman who has lived in Bozeman, have you experienced racism?
Absolutely. And let me just say that racism does exist all over the country. It exists in small towns, large cities, rural America, and urban America. My husband and I chose to move to Bozeman because we love it here, and it's like where we grew up. And recognizing that this is a very homogenous community, we were aware of that. And we definitely checked it out as far as overt racism when we moved here before making that decision. And we definitely did our homework. We talked to people. We walked downtown hand in hand, all those kinds of things during broad daylight and during the night, and saw that we were welcomed here by the community. So, yes, I have been subject to racism both here in Bozeman and in greater part of Montana. Everything from being called the N-word to being called other epithets to being let me give you an example. I was standing in the deli line at Town and Country on 19th Avenue. Several years ago during the noon hour, and it was crowded. It was noon hour. People were ordering sandwiches and meat and cheese to go and things like that. And I was waiting in a long line, and I was surrounded by white people. I was the only African American, the only person of color in the entire line. There were 3 cashiers behind, or 3 clerks or deli servers. I don't know what they're called. And the man in back of me kept staring at me. And so I decided, okay, well, I'll just turn around and say, hi, how are you today? And he looked at me dead serious and said in a loud voice, I know you. And I'm thinking, I'm like, what? I don't recognize him. What? He says, you're the gal who stole my wallet on the DC Metro. Yes.
I'm sorry. Just to make that leap of connection, it just caused me to pause.
Yeah. Exactly. It was a shocking statement. Bozeman, Montana, DC Metro. What? Huh? So, you know what? My answer to what he had to say doesn't really matter. I mean, I didn't cuss. I didn't put him down. But what deeply affected me much more, what affected me far more than his statement, was the fact that suddenly everybody around me, in front of me, in back of me, even the clerks who are handling the orders, were all silent and suddenly looking elsewhere. Looking at the floor, looking at the ceiling, looking down an aisle, looking at their watch, digging in their purse for something, whatever. But not a single person came to my defense. Not a single person said, hey, buddy, you are really out of line. Not a single person said, get with it. Not a single person said, curb your racism. Nothing. And white silence is white consent. I just got to say that. It's white consent.
So by not speaking up is probably the most subtle form of racism?
It's one of the most subtle forms of racism. When you see it, when you hear it, and you don't say anything about it, when you don't call it out for what it really is, it's absolutely, it's condoning it. Your silence is condoning it. And so one of the reasons that Racial Equity Montana exists is to point out those things and to encourage people to recognize how these things happen, and to gain your courage. Practice in your mind what you would say if you're at a party and somebody refers to a black person in a disparaging manner, or a Native American or an Asian person, somebody who, whose family originates from Asia, way back in the generations. It doesn't matter. Think of how you would respond to that. And then when it happens next, because it will, then you'll have the tools to do something. Instead of just saying, I'm too nervous, I'm afraid, then you'll already have it worked out.
It is 1450 KMMS, 1340 KPRK. My name is Chris Griffin. Joining me in studio, Judith Heilman. The opening conversation in a rolling forum on race in America, Montana, and Bozeman. I guess I'm almost obligated to ask the question, are you aware of when you are practicing reverse racism? Is reverse racism possible? Do you have a racist view towards white people?
Actually, I would say no. Being black in America, especially if you're growing up in a multicultural setting rather than an all white setting or in an all black setting, I can traverse two cultures. I'm of two cultures. So I'm perfectly comfortable in the black culture, like if I was surrounded by all black people, and I'm perfectly comfortable in the white culture. Although in the white culture, I generally have what I personally call my black guard up a little bit more, because you never know what somebody's going to say, given the deli line at the local grocery store. Yeah, I wouldn't say that I have that. And I've seen so much racism, subtle and overt, that, I know it for what it is, and I combat it in different ways that I feel comfortable. So I don't feel like I do any reverse racism myself.
From a much learned experience than mine, and you may have a very interesting perspective, what is the genesis of racism and race problems in Bozeman? Where does racism generate? Because, I don't have kids, but my nephew is now becoming a young man. I can remember when he was growing up, the only thing he didn't like was taking naps. Nobody taught him, not to hold different or very specific views of people based on race. Where does racism come from?
Well, you have to be taught it.
It is a learned behavior. It is
a learned behavior. No one is born hating, and so you have to be taught it. And in many ways, it's just lack of knowledge, and that lack of knowledge supported by the environment, the people around them. I remember when I first came here, a little over 10 years ago, I would get stares from little children in grocery stores who'd be staring at me. But, you know, and I figured out, well, maybe they haven't seen a black person before. And, but, you know, I didn't think anything of it. I just took that as it was and, you know, say hi and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't have anybody running away from me. But really, that comes to another point of what called aversive racism. If you are in a, say you go out to lunch and you go to a place where there's all, you know, you pick up your lunch order and then you can choose whatever seats you want. And say there's only 2 tables left with 2 spare seats. And, you know, somebody's already at the seat, at the other chair at the table, or a group of other people. And at one table is a white person and at one table is a black person. Well, you have a choice of which one you're going to go sit at. Do you choose the table with a white person because you are afraid or uncomfortable or don't know any black people? And so what is that? And so your choice, if you choose a white person based on your degree of comfortableness, and that you don't really know any black people, you have actually deprived yourself of the opportunity to get to know somebody who's black. You're going to where you're comfortable. And that's called aversive racism or selective racism. Mm-hmm.
Well, then why does that occur? Because to be perfectly honest, if I'm going to sit down somewhere to eat lunch, I'm sitting down at the closest seat and I don't care who's sitting next to me. I will strike up a conversation. Why isn't that more prevalent in society? I mean, because honestly, it's a seat I want to eat. I need to sit to eat.
I can't answer that question. I can't answer why that's so prevalent. But it is. People do that at school games, you know, where there are bleachers, you know, choices of bleachers, and maybe there are some black people in one bleacher that you walk past. If you're white, you walk past those and walk on to the other bleachers where maybe there's some white people that you feel more comfortable with, or that you, or maybe even you don't know, you know, maybe you don't know them, maybe you do know them, whatever. Personally, I think the bleachers with the black folk are a lot more fun. It doesn't stop me from making my choice from where I think the best seat in the house is, though.
It is 1450 KMMS, 1340 KPRK. Judith Heilman, one of the founders of Racial Equity Montana, as well as a former Palo Alto Police Department detective, in the studio discussing subtle racism in the opening conversation in a continuing series of race relations in America, Montana, and Bozeman. Knowing this, and if this is somebody's first understanding that there are race issues, racism is alive and well in Bozeman, what can we do? What can we do as Bozemanites to change this culture? And I use that as the only convenient word that came to my mind, but that's not the right word, because I don't think there is a culture of racism in Bozeman, even though there is racism in Bozeman. Oh, you rolled your eyes and you're going to come at me?
No.
But how can we? How do we change this?
I'm sorry, you misinterpreted the rolling of my eyes. The rolling of my eyes was me thinking. Oh. You know, I'm one of those visual thinkers.
Understood.
Well, there still is racism in Bozeman, as I said. Mm-hmm. Racism in Montana. And it's as subtle as if you see somebody, well, let me put it this way. Often I wear my hair in an afro, or like it is right now, in braids, in long braids down my back. If somebody I don't know reaches out and touches my hair, that, without asking me, or without complimenting me or saying, I love your hair, you know, may I touch it? Or, and I may say yes and I may say no, but to just reach out and touch my hair, that is extremely offensive. That's extremely offensive. I can't imagine if you have people who just reach out and touch your hair without knowing you?
No, I have never had that experience.
I'm not a pet in a petting zoo. Seriously, I'm not. And no black person is. And you know what? This happens with Native Americans when they wear their hair in braids as well. Many Native Americans have told me that people reach out and touch their braids. It does amaze me. So when you see things like that, or if you have that urge to do that, don't. Please don't. Other things of coming up and asking me or another person who's a minority, saying, where are you from? Bozeman? No, I mean, really, where are you from? America? No, seriously, where are you from? And, and just going on and on and on like that is just, what are you trying to ask me? Or how come you don't speak, how come you speak the way you do? I'm thinking, what do you mean, how come I speak the way I do? I grew up just sort of speaking. So they're trying to place me. They're trying to categorize me. They're trying to figure me out. And then once they think that they are totally frustrated and can't really get the answers that they get, or for some reason that I've been able to answer their questions, then they just walk away. And that in itself that's a microaggression as well, because all they want to do is categorize you. And once they've gotten their information, then they walk away. What kind of education do you have? What job do you do, or whatever? And then they're gone. And that's treating me as an object as well. That's really, really not cool. That's not cool. So you have to recognize that there's so many different things that are representative of racism and that are racism. And it's generally, most people do this out of, I don't want this word to be misinterpreted, ignorance, but they just don't know. And they just need to learn. You can Google all this stuff and get your answers.
It is 1450 KMMS, 1340 KPRK. My name is Chris Griffin. Joining me in studio, Judith Heilman, one of the founders of Racial Equity Montana, REM. You can find them on Facebook. My final question, because we've already run out of time, but I'm fascinated by where are you from? That question of where are you from? Very early, because of my grandparents' immigration to America, I knew at a very early age, I'm half Polish, I'm half Irish. Is that microaggression? Is identifying myself as Irish Polish? Is that a microaggression or of racism?
I don't know white on white if that is right or not. I do know that white on minority combined, usually in combination with other things, where you can definitely pin it as that. And before we do go, I just want to make sure that people are aware of Bozeman's Charleston Memorial that will be happening tomorrow evening at the Bozeman Public Library in the large community room from 6 to 7 p.m. It's going to be an hour of just talking about the victims. There'll be people speaking, city officials speaking, and community members speaking. There'll be music. There'll be a little bit of mourning. There'll be happiness. There'll be some time for reflection, and it's a healing thing for Bozeman.
Well, Judith Heilman, it's a pleasure to meet you. I thank you for your time this morning. Don't be a stranger to this morning show program. I appreciate your time, and thank you for your insight.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me. And if anybody's interested in getting to know more about Racial Equity Montana, you can find us on Facebook.
And you know what? I'll throw it up on a link on the conversation because I will be posting this audio to the website later today. Again, I appreciate your time. Pleasure to meet you, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Chris.